Thanks, Amanuel. I always am in awe when he speaks because he's just so full of wisdom. So I think that on this kind of topic around what's happening in our community, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is something that has been going on for a very long time. I think now our trauma and our anger has been put on display for all to see. And so, you know, no one can unhear or unknow. And so the call to action has begun, which I think that we all can appreciate. I think when we are talking about the effects of COVID-19 more specifically on Black communities, we, as an organization, had put together the Black to the Future report. And I think that, which was a collective of about 40 agencies that were in the categories that Amanuel had described: Black-led, Black-focused, Black-serving. And I think it's really important to just pause there and acknowledge there's a lot of organizations by the virtue of class and race going hand in hand that are Black-serving, but they are not Black-focused and they're not Black-led. And I think that's very important to acknowledge. The work that we do at C, a lot of it is around training Black serving organizations that do not come from a Black lens and a culturally specific lens on how to serve Black youth properly and how to engage them in a real way that will have long sustainable change. And I think that when it comes to foundations, in my experience, as a leader of a social service agency, we train young people who are furthest from the labor market, and our mission is very clear and simple. We want to be able to create a society and an economy where Black youth can thrive financially and also have a good quality of life, just like any other Canadian would, and that they would be able to contribute to the advancement of Canada. And so it sounds like a very simple mission, but it's actually extremely hard. And I often find it very hard to articulate to people. We do a very person-centered approach. So the young person, who they are, we acknowledge no matter who you are in this country. You could have a very high income, much to what Amanuel had suggested. My parents could be millionaires. The reality is, when I walk down the street, I'm also East African. My parents are both from Ethiopia, and I acknowledge that. But when I'm walking down the street, someone is not like, "Oh, look at that East African girl whose parents have a lot of money." They don't, but I'm simply using that to say that anti-Black racism, regardless of your class, regardless of where you stand in society, it is going to affect you. People are going to treat you in a particular way if they have this notion or have an ounce of voluntary or involuntary anti-Black racism in their mindset. And I think it's important to also acknowledge that when we are going out to have conversations with foundations and non-governmental agencies, I would say, government, it's easy to hold them accountable because they have a duty to serve us and we are paying taxes, and therefore you can hold them to a higher, you can hold them accountable to what they fund and what they don't fund. I find that it's very challenging when we're dealing with foundations because a lot of them have no connection to community, especially our community. They also are not understanding of the issues that our communities are facing and what organizations are facing. You know, I think much to what Amanuel had said, this is generational. This didn't just show up and it just didn't stop and take a halt at the south border. Anti-Black racism is very clear in all of that we do. And I think that when we think about the history of instances where money could be thrown, I don't think that it's about money. It's not about give more money to Black 3B, we call them 3B, Black focused, Black serving, Black led. We're not saying give more money to 3B organizations and the problem will be solved. It's not about that. The reality is we've seen that in history and the abolishment of slavery. Okay, you're free. Okay, where do we go? What do we eat? How do we make money? Like, the system had designed for Black people to then have to still work for the people who own them for however many years and just work for low wages and be able to only make enough to feed their families. This is something that we have seen in history time and time again. Here's some money, but there's no understanding of the issues. There's no mentorship. There's no acknowledgement that these Black communities do not have the tools to be able to have a level playing ground. And I think when we're thinking about building relationships, I think that we need to think about what are outside of, okay, yes, there's money that needs to be had, but how are we understanding in an intimate way what the issues of agencies are and also these communities. And I want to use an example because we are funded by a foundation that I think does this extremely well. So the Myrie Foundation, they are one of our funders, and they provide us with unrestricted funds. Myrie Foundation is the one funder that I think has allowed us to be able to do our work in a very intentional way. And this is why. We are constantly, just like every other organization, trying to find ways for us to fit into the box of the funding mold. And what they've done is said, what outside of that do you need money for? And at C, we do something called the person-centered approach, which most Black-led, Black-serving agencies do. We acknowledge that the sheer reality of you being a Black person in this country, you are coming with a level of trauma through our doors. That can be compounded by many other factors, but at the baseline, you're dealing with some level of trauma. So our job is to look at that young person as they are and look at exactly what those barriers are and try and knock them down one by one. And for us in the midst of this pandemic, people didn't understand that work to begin with because it doesn't fit in a box. There's not how much money it costs per person, because an individual is going to come with a whole lot of bags. And at C, we say, bring all of your bags, bring all your luggage. It doesn't even need to be like folded nicely. Bring it all, drop it at our doorstep, and then we'll try and make sense of it for you. We'll throw out what doesn't need to be used, and then we'll take some of the old vintage stuff that you have, some of your old trauma. Maybe you have skills that maybe you sold drugs in the past. Those are transferable skills. You know how to do math. You know how to build relationship. Like, let's take whatever it is that you have had in your past and try and reorganize it. And that work means one person might cost us $10,000. One person might cost us $50,000. We don't know. It's about whatever barriers that society has created. And so I think that the reason why I use that example is, you know, we have something called the Hardship Fund. Myrie Foundation has been open to say, okay, name what those things are. Tell us about what that is so that we can be able to help you address that. And not only just that, it's not about the exchange of money and the unrestricted funds. It's also, we've built a relationship with this funder to also say, like, our staff actually need system navigation training. You know, I'm a graduate of their policy school, and any other types of training that my staff have needed, I've been able to go to them and share the vulnerability in our organization and say, this area is not very strong and we need to strengthen it. Or we have this idea, we've gone to them with social enterprise ideas, etc. And the resources in order to wrap our minds around that have been provided to us. So it's not necessarily only about an exchange of money. It's about wanting to understand, wanting to have a conversation about how the organization can be strengthened. Because if we have a bunch of money and we don't know what to do with it, we don't know what it is that we need, we don't know how to tell the story, whatever that might be, then the money's useless, right? There has to be some type of mentorship. And to be honest, writing the Black to the Future report with this request, very few foundations responded. Only the major, you know, the city and the province are the only ones who really said, okay, what can we do with this? And so I say that simply to say that it has to be an organic desire to get to know communities and solve the problems in them. And I think that also takes taking a hard look at who's on the board and who is making these decisions, because if you don't know what you don't know, And I think there's a very false perception that, you know, Indigenous and Black communities definitely have been deemed to have very unique barriers. And I think that a lot of the time it's very obvious, Indigenous communities, their land has been stolen. It's very, very clear. It's very clean cut. But I think that there's a perception with Black communities that we need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and that we have created this is a problem that we've created for ourselves. And that's just not the case. And so I think the acknowledgement of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, et cetera, needs to be acknowledged at all levels. And I even take it a step further to test the board and your leadership, to ask them questions to clarify that they actually understand what anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, period, is doing on the ground and to the lives of Canadians. Because I think it's one thing to say that, oh, we're diverse and look at our board, but you really need to have clarifying questions to ensure that you really understand that. And the last point I'm going to make before I kind of move on from and pass it over to Evelyn is really helping people also understand that, you know, I often describe us as a middle child. There's a very few older siblings that are larger Black-led, Black-serving agencies. We're in the middle. We're a middle child, maybe have 5 or 6 in the city of Toronto, big brothers that are larger than us. And we just received charitable status in 2018. We have a lot of younger brothers and sisters that are grassroots organizations that are struggling, but doing the work. And I do not think that, I think when we create barriers like 2 years of audited financials and, you know, you have to be a registered charity, when you create those types of barriers for these agencies, you are basically forcing them, because they're going to fight the good fight. So they're going to volunteer their time. You're basically telling them that the work that they're doing is not valid and it doesn't deserve to be paid. And I think that's a very strong message that's being sent. And I think it's a dangerous message, because it's just going to continue to perpetuate what it is that we're already seeing. So those are my thoughts. So I will pass that over